Our scripture reading is Acts chapter 5, verse 15. So that they are even carried out the sick into the streets, and laid them on beds and pallets, that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them.
I wish to thank Pat Youngberg, also Inuk, for sharing music ministry with us this morning. Thank you. I gave Gloria a really long passage.
That's what I'm going to say.
Smart.
Smart, right?
The book of Acts is the story of how the church emerged in the ancient world. And if you'll recall, Peter, the apostle, is the dominant figure as this story unfolds. You remember that at Pentecost, which was the beginning of the church, Peter preached a very powerful sermon. In fact, 3,000 souls joined the church that day. That's a good new membership class for any church. But the church began to emerge. And as the temple increased, great crowds gathered to be in the presence of Peter and the other apostles. And as we read, miracles were performed. And from all around, people began bringing the sick, the lame, and the disabled. And from that, we read this powerful sentence that Gloria read this morning. Sick people were brought out into the streets on beds and mats, so that at least Peter's shadow would fall across some of them as he went by. The arresting word for me in this passage is a statement about Peter's shadow falling on some of the sick as they went by. You see, so great was their confidence in Peter, who had become the dominant leader in the church at that time, that people believed that his very shadow had healing power. Superstition, you say? Maybe. And there's no evidence whatsoever that Peter kind of condoned this belief. And yet, I find it an intriguing thought. We speak of the shadow of influence. And you know, there are people now who make big bucks being influencers. Whether it be in the political realm, the economic realm, the social realm, the healthcare realm, people who are influencers, who try to pursue one's thoughts and one's loyalties in a given direction. Shadows of influence. And yet we all know that our shadow can be for good, it can be for evil. So I would point out, first of all, as we respond to this text, I would like to offer up two kinds of influence. I know there are many others, but two come to mind. One is a conscious influence. It's the influence that is deliberately generated by what we do, by what we say, and how we act. There's a Chinese proverb that goes, not the cry, but the flight of the duck leads the flock to fly and follow. I feel very fortunate in Bethany. Every morning very early and every evening around dusk time, Canadian geese fly specifically over my home here in Bethany. And I got thinking about that. A goose or one duck does not influence another by simply waddling around with a quack quack here and a quack quack there. But if a duck or a goose wants to influence the course of things, that duck lifts himself off of the ground into flight and encourages others to follow. The shadow of influence. And a part of it is things we deliberately and consciously generate. It's the product of intention. It is something done and actually accomplished. A man and his family who happened to be new to a given community went to the barber to get a haircut. And as happens in many barbershops, all kinds of topics are discussed. But the man got around to asking the barber, are you a member of a church? And he said, no, I'm not a member. The barber responded, I'm not a member of the church, but if I had to go to the church, it would be the one down the street, the one with the high steeple. And the man was curious and he asked, well, why would you join that church? And the barber replied, well, you know Dino Smith? The man who owns the hardware store right next to my barber shop, he goes to that church. And if all the people in that church are like Dino Smith, that's where I want to be. So there was some kind of an influence, the way that Mr. Smith conducted his life, maybe his business with integrity, that made a conscious influence on Mr. Smith. A conscious influence. Mark Twain once said rather cynically, few things in life are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example. That may be true, but friends, you know, the world would be a very bleak place in which to live if there were not many people who were trying and struggling to live out a good example, who were consciously trying to be what God would have us to be. So there's this conscious influence that operates in your life and in my life every day. And then I would suggest an unconscious influence. Those subtle influences that we are not even aware of sometimes or even know about. An influence that results not so much from what we do, but from who we are as people. It's the aggregate total of your character and my character. And I believe it reveals itself in words and actions and looks that really aren't meant to accomplish anything, but are inevitably influential as those acts and attitudes mold and shape the lives of others. The story is told of a young couple who joined a given church. And a deacon of that church asked this couple one day, why did you choose to join our church? And they said together, well, you know, we were out getting ice cream one day, and we saw a member of the church who greeted us at coffee hour. And as our children, ages 4 and 6, were approaching the ice cream stand, this man noticed them. He bent down, and he interacted with them. He made contact with them. And we thought to ourselves, if this church is like this man, who is showing compassion and care for our children, this must be a child-loving church. And believe it or not, that had an impact on why we joined your church. You know what? It's a frightening time to contemplate the power of the unconscious, unknowing influence that all of us can exert every day. It can be good, it can be do good, it can be harmful. Someone once penned these words, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. The shadow of influence is a powerful thing. You know, over the years, a little bit of a tangent here, people have wondered about why men and women are so different. That we have different emotional makeups, different needs. In fact, I was thinking, I can't believe it, it was 30 years ago that John Gray wrote a book called Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus. Some of you may remember that. It basically was quite a serious book. And the point was that men and women have different emotional requirements. And if those requirements kind of gel in a relationship, the relationship could be healthy and hopeful and healthy. But if they do not balance, then those emotional requirements, then the relationship could very well become destructive. And I read recently of a modern Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus. It was in a computer science class that was taught by a teacher in a local community college. And about 5 or 6 weeks into this class, the professor decided to have some fun, as well as use this as a learning mechanism, and he broke the class into 2 segments. The men on one side of the room, the women on the other side of the room, and he gave them this question. If a computer were to be man or woman, what would it be? And so each of the groups huddled together for about 15 to 20 minutes, and so then the men came back and said, well, we understand this completely. We have 4 reasons why computers should be feminine. Reason number 1, no one but their creator understands their internal logic. Computers should be feminine, they said, secondly, because they speak in a special code language that only they can understand. Computers should be feminine. The third reason, they said, is because they store all the material on a hard drive to be retrieved for later reference. And fourthly, the men said computers should be feminine because as soon as you commit to one, you will spend so much money with accessorizing it. But the men did not have the last laugh. The women came forward and said, well, computers should be masculine because number 1, first, in order to get their attention, you need to turn them on. And secondly, computers should be feminine because they store a lot of data, but they can't think for themselves. And thirdly, computers should be masculine because they're supposed to help you solve problems, and half of the time, they are the problem. And fourthly, they said computers should be feminine because as soon as you commit to one, you realize that if you waited a little bit longer, you could have a different model. Well, just for fun, though, those kind of stigmatizing images and influences that pass down through the centuries remain with us. The influence, unconscious and conscious. Which brings me to my second point, is that none of us live to ourselves. Your life and my life, we interact with other people. You may remember that famous line from John Donne's poetry, "No man is an island unto himself." Our influence always impacts the life of others. And I believe it's one of the realities of our Christian witness, yours and mine. We can steer another person in the wrong way without ever being aware of that influence. Or we can lift their sights higher as they see the light that we are shining. I remember one time our family took a commercial boat out of Cape Cod. Actually, it's out of Provincetown. A commercial fishing boat. And as we moved out of the harbor, there was a sign in big letters that said, "You are responsible for your wake. You are responsible for your wake." As you realize, if you've ever been on a boat, when you move in the water beyond the dock, You have to be aware that the wake from your boat and the powerful engines that are stirring the water can damage boats that are tied to the dock. The sign was sending a warning, a caution sign, to all who approach that dock. If damage is done because of the wake that you are generating, then you are responsible. And kind of let the weight of that sign sink in. We are responsible for our wake. So how do we translate that then to our personal lives? Personally, it begins with a thorough self-examination, asking ourselves the question, what is my shadow like? Who does my shadow affect? Is there anything in my life that blots out the vision of Christ in my influence, in the shadow of my witness? Does it need to be examined? What sort of shadow are you casting? Personally, all of us have to live with ourselves. No matter where we go, we take ourselves with us. I remember a very haunting melody written by Billy Rose called Me and My Shadow. And I quote, "Shadows of night are falling, and I'm lonely, standing on the corner feeling blue. Sweethearts out for fun, pass me one by one. Guess I'll line up like I always do, with me and my shadow strolling down the avenue. Me and my shadow, not a soul to tell our troubles to. And when it's 12 o'clock, we climb the stairs. We never knock, for no one's there. Just me and my shadow, all alone and feeling blue." Our lives begin, my friends, always with ourselves. And all of us, as honestly as we know how, need to look at ourselves personally and ask what kind of shadow we are casting. And then how about the shadow that we cast in our families? I've said before from this pulpit, I believe that the family is where life makes up its mind. And you know, it's one of the hardest places to be Christ-like, because it's where we let our hair down, where we wear our worst manners, where we act the worst with the people we love the most. And yet, isn't it the family where the most telling influences of life are to be found? And I can't help but think of my own father. He never lectured me on any kind of religion or faith, and yet there was always with him a consistency, an integrity about the way he did things. And I can always remember as a young boy, he would kneel by my bed and say his own nighttime prayers. And the memories of that still give me some strength and comfort across a lifetime. Shadows of influence within the family. And sometimes we come to know God best through the lives of other people, people that we may meet here in our own church. And what about our shadow in the church? What kind of shadows are we casting here? I've had enough experiences being members of churches in my past to realize, and I don't mean to be judgmental here, but there are people in the church who are chronic complainers and whiners. What is that saying to others about Christ? And there are people in churches who merely sit on the sidelines, never stopping forward to say, "Here I am, send me, I'm willing to do what I can." And then there are people who always volunteer but never follow through, convinced that somehow or other another person will pick up the responsibility. Church life involves more than talking about the ways of Christ. It involves walking in the ways of Christ. It's one thing to talk the talk. It's another thing to walk the walk. The shadow of influence is conveying to others what we really think about God and about how we live our lives, personally, in our family, in our workplace, and in our church. All of us. And I think this is particularly relevant as we approach this special meeting after church today, as we look forward to our future and make decisions that will influence the future of our church. What kind of shadows are we casting? We are responsible for our wake. The shadow we cast is a result of our position to the sun if we are outside. The influence of our character and the spiritual content of our lives is entirely dependent upon and conditioned by our relationship to Jesus Christ. If there is anything in our lives that blots out that sunshine from creating our shadow, it's something that we need to work on. We need to pray about, to talk to others about, so that others will see something more of Him in us. I close with these words. My life may touch a dozen lives before this day is done. Does love in every hand clasp flow in sympathy's caress? Do those I have greeted know a newborn hopefulness? Are tolerance and charity the keynote of my song? As I go plodding onward with earth's eager, anxious throng, my life shall touch a number of lives today, and wherever I go, from this dear world of struggle to a land that I do not know. So this I always wish, the prayer I ever pray, let my life help other lives it passes by on the way. May it be so. May it be so. Amen.